It's time for another episode of the Cultural Hall, and I went back into the history of how long it has taken us to be able to coordinate schedules and be able to get this to happen. It's almost a year. Gary Boatright, welcome to the Cultural Hall.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Gary is the operations manager for the Historic Sites Division of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and I think you first reached out to us on Twitter and said, hey guys, this is who I am, or how did we get connected? I just know that that's where we started over a year ago. And how are we here?
Well, I think you reached out to me. But again, it's like I said, it's been like a year ago. I follow you on Twitter and I think you follow me, and I think we just kind of got connected, and I know you've talked to a few other of my colleagues in the church history department over the years, and I don't remember the specifics, but here we are. Finally.
Yeah, we made it. So let me ask you this. What does the operations manager for the Historic Sites Division of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints do?
So that is something that my kids ask me all the time. They still haven't figured out what I do. The best way I like to explain it is this. All the historic sites of the church are grouped into groups of 10. So we have the New York and Pennsylvania historic sites, and there's 5 historic sites over there, but there's one couple who serves as the site leaders over that.
Okay.
And so we have 10 couples who serve as historic site leaders. And the simplest way to explain what I do is my job is to make sure that the site leaders and their missionaries have the tools and the resources to fulfill their callings, and to basically make sure they're happy. That's the feel good description of what my job entails, but really it is all the day-to-day operation that the historic sites of the church across the country, from the Joseph Smith Birthplace to the Mormon Battalion Historic Site in San Diego.
So you are just United States?
Just United States, just the official historic sites, and we classify historic sites as the places where we have missionaries who provide interpretation. So as we know, there's historic sites tied to the church all around the world, but these are the places where the church actually calls missionaries, full-time missionaries, to serve, or service missionaries in some cases.
So are there, drilling down then on this, are there no historic sites? To me, I guess I would think that there would be full-time missionaries or service missionaries maybe serving in England at some sort of historic site. Is that not the case?
So there is one site, the restored Gadfield Elm Chapel, where there are service missionaries serving there, but that's classified as a historic meeting house in the historic sites program. And so like the Paris, Idaho Tabernacle, the Pine Valley Chapel near St. George, they're historic places of the church, but the management of those is on a more local basis rather than a church headquarters basis.
Okay. But the historic sites are more of a church basis, and that's you.
Correct.
I love it. So then the next obvious question to me is, how many historic sites does the church have?
So we count 23.
Okay.
And some of those actually are not sites that we have missionaries, but they're in the groupings of sites. So for example, in Missouri, the 2 sites where we have missionaries are the Independence Visitor Center and Liberty Jail. But we also have the Hawn's Mill Massacre site and the Far West Temple site that's nearby, and those fall under our stewardship as well.
So I'm racking my brain and I'm trying to think of 23. Would it be beneficial? I mean, so let me see how many I can rattle off, and you tell me. Can you keep a running count, and I'll rattle these off?
Let me get a piece of paper here.
Okay. Because this is a game that I think is awesome, especially knowing that we have the entire United States. I wonder how many of these 23 I'm going to get.
Okay.
All right. So we get obviously the birthplace of the prophet Joseph Smith. So Sharon, Vermont.
Yep.
You have Sacred Grove. You have the site of the Priesthood restoration. Then you get into Kirtland, and you have the Kirtland Temple. Now, in Kirtland, do you differentiate like the Kirtland, because there is the Community of Christ Church owns the Kirtland Temple. Do you count the Kirtland Temple or the Kirtland area as just an historic site because there's like the Newell K. Whitney store and the granary and all that? Is that all one site?
So we classify historic Kirtland, which is where the Newell K. Whitney store and the area that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saint owns as a site. We don't technically count the Kirtland Temple as our historic site because it's not our historic site, but it certainly is a historic site. So that is not part of the 23.
Okay. So then I would say the Johnson Farm. So Hiram, Ohio. And then you gave me a couple of them. We got the 4 in Missouri, the Far West, the Hawn's Mill, the Independence, and the Liberty Jail. Let me think if there's something that I'm missing along the east. What am I missing? Let me go other ones. So then you mentioned you got San Diego. So the Mormon battalion down there. I'm going to guess that Cedar Fort is one of these. Is that correct?
Cofort.
Or Cofort. That's what I mean.
Cofort. Yep. Cofort is one of them.
The Devils, whatever, in Wyoming. Where the pioneers came through.
So Martin's Cove, yeah.
Okay. Yes, nice. I don't have the exact names on all this, but I'm feeling good. How many am I up to right now?
I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12.
Oh, so I don't even barely have
about
half.
Halfway there.
I don't even barely have half.
Want me to fill in the rest?
Oh, I forgot everything with Nauvoo. So you've got the Nauvoo Temple. Do you count Nauvoo like Kirtland, that it's just like Nauvoo?
Yeah, Nauvoo is one because there's more than a dozen buildings there, and then Carthage. We separate that out.
Okay, so I would have got those two. Now I'm curious. That to me makes me think that there are 9 that didn't come obvious to mind.
So up in the New York area, we also have the Whitmer farm, where the church was organized. We also have the Grandin building, which is the location of the publication of the Book of Mormon. I was impressed you got the Johnson farm. Most people don't think of that.
Well, I'm waiting for the temple to be there like it was prophesied. I served my mission in Cleveland, so we got to spend a lot of time down there.
Let's see, you got Missouri, San Diego, Cofort, in St. George, Utah. In that area, we have the St. George Tabernacle.
Okay, which is a gorgeous place. My goodness, right there in the heart of the town.
It is, and the church just a few years ago did a wonderful restoration of that. Then we have the
hold on. I bet I can get one like Brigham Young's home that's also in like Santa Clara or St. George or somewhere around there.
Yep, and the Hamblin home.
Okay.
So got those 3 down there. In Omaha, we have the Mormon Trail Center at the Winter Quarters Cemetery. And then across the river from that in Council Bluffs, we used to have the Canesville Tabernacle, but that site is actually being redeveloped into more of a Canesville memorial that will tell the story of Canesville. And we can get into that a little bit more.
Yeah, please.
If you want. And then in Wyoming, you mentioned Martin's Cove, but we also have Sixth Crossing and Rock Creek Hollow. Those 3 places along the Mormon Trail. And I think that I wasn't writing down what I was saying, but that should be 23.
Does the church have any involvement with This Is the Place? Is that a historic site that This Is the Place?
No, we have probably a loose relationship with them, but we haven't done much with them in my time in the department.
So that's a lot, Gary. That's a lot under your purview.
It is, and we have a staff of, I think we're up to 16 full-time staff members now. We have 3 excellent interns working with us now and a handful of missionaries here at church headquarters. So the reality is we don't have one person to assign to each site. Wow. So it is quite a handful, and I like to think of it as good job security for the remainder of my career.
Now, let me ask you this, because I know it's a concern for a lot of people, especially recently when you look at places like the Manti Temple, the fact that because we're sort of issuing in the 21st century, there is some part of the church that is like, new, big, grand, let's do it, take down the old stuff. How do you, within these historic sites, how do you and how do you feel like the church is negotiating to know what to preserve and what to say, like, oh, that's okay, we can let that go?
So I can't really comment on what's been happening with the temples.
Sure.
I'm not involved in any of those discussions at all, but I can say that with the historic sites, that there has been a lot of attention and a lot of focus on preservation, also accuracy as well, and a lot of time, effort, research going into projects to make sure that they're as accurate as possible. And we saw this, with the development of the Priesthood restoration site several years ago. And currently we have a project right now in Kirtland where we're restoring the Joseph and Emma Smith home in Kirtland, which is just down the street from the Kirtland Temple.
Yeah, at the time that I served my mission, you could rent it for like $600 a month. That was the joke that we always made, where people, we had the opportunity to talk to, I can't think of it, Carl Ricks Anderson. That's it.
Yep.
And he would always point out, and that's the Joseph Smith home where you can rent it for $600 a month if you can be the next renter to be able to live there. And we always thought, wait, what? Joseph Smith's home is just like a private entity that can be rented out, but the church recently has purchased that and is stripping it down to what it originally was.
Correct. And I would clarify, we're not stripping it down, although it looks like that way, but it really is peeling off those layers, getting down to the 1830s home that was Joseph and Emma Smith's, and then where we need to reconstruct portions so that at the end of the day, we have an accurate reconstruction, and something that we hope that if Joseph and Emma were alive and they were walking down the street, they would be able to stop and look and say, hey, that's our house.
Yeah, I appreciate that attention to accuracy, and and the opportunity that we'll have to be able to view that as it was in 1830. Another one that I feel like has garnered a lot of attention is everything with Hill Cumorah, with the ending of the Hill Cumorah pageant. And we're like, yes, trees, everyone grab a tree, plant a tree. Give me some context as to why that's so important, and maybe a little bit more depth into what that project is.
So as you know, you noted that the Hill Cumorah pageant was canceled. And 2020 was going to be, I think, the last one, if I remember right. And of course, the world went to heck with the pandemic, and the church eventually decided just the pageant's done. And so we had known that, well, we were kind of preparing for that in case that ever happened, because when you look at the history of the Hill Cumorah, it really is one of the most sacred sites of the restoration. I mean, it's a place where Joseph went, 4 years in a row to be taught and tutored by Moroni, and eventually from which he pulled the gold plates, which we have the Book of Mormon from. And the Hill Cumorah has a long history of being a pageant stage, and there's a history of why that happened. The pageant actually had its roots in the Sacred Grove. And I'm very glad that they moved the pageant from the Sacred Grove, and it bounced around to a place or two before it ended up on the Hill Cumorah. But over the years, as the Hill Cumorah pageant grew, so did the infrastructure. And so there were multiple buildings that were built to support the pageant. There was an facilities management office, an area that was put behind the hill. There was just growing infrastructure. And when the church made the decision to discontinue the pageants, we saw an opportunity where we could restore the Hill Cumorah to its 1820s appearance. Now, restoring a landscape is a lot different than restoring a home, because you're dealing with living things. And so what we did is really created a plan to take all the pageant elements off of the hill. All these buildings, I think there was like 16 buildings or something total that we actually took down. We took a lot of that underground infrastructure out as well. We moved the facilities management offices to another location, and we added some trails to the hill Cumorah. And all this in an effort that people would have a greater sense and understanding of what it was like when Joseph went there. Now, the big area of the hill, the bare area where they held the pageant, there was some discussions of, well, do we plant trees? Do we start with seedlings? Do we just go with seeds? And working with Robert Parrott, our forester there, and a team of others, we felt it was best to really see if we can get some natural regeneration, but also help kickstart it by planting and spreading seeds. We had talked about using seedlings or saplings, and maybe even some larger trees, but we decided not to do that for a variety of reasons, because any saplings that you get from a nursery are not as strong as a natural growing tree, something that took root on its own. And the other thing is too, if we put in like larger trees, with that being an open area, the trees wouldn't grow straight up like they would in a forest. They would grow out like these nice trees you see in a park, which is great for a park setting, but terrible if you want a forest.
Right.
And so we decided that, we'll just do the seeds, and we'll let do that in combination with Mother Nature. So we had our final big push with the project was just last November. Myself and Ben Pikel's, our director, went out there. We had recruited the missionaries from the New York Syracuse mission, and we had thousands and thousands of seeds of hardwood trees that are native to the area. And we just spread them and planted them all on that hill. And it was one of the most amazing experiences I've had in my career. It was November 11th, if I remember right. And, the weather in November in New York, it can be hit and miss. And we had been looking at the weather for several weeks at the forecast beforehand, and it just looked like it was going to be rain and, just terrible weather. Well, the 2 days we were there the Thursday before to kind of prep and stuff. It was 70 degrees. Wow. The next morning when we had the missionaries come, it was a cool morning, very light breeze, perfect for spreading seeds. We got everything planted, and just as we were wrapping up, it started raining, which is exactly what those seeds needed to help, and it rained for like 3 days. We were told after that. But it was just, everything worked out perfect. Kind of a funny, not funny coincidence, but something really neat is decades before, Willard Bean had done a similar thing. He had invited missionaries from the area to come and help reforest the hill Cumorah. His reforestation efforts were primarily with pine trees, and mainly because he was from Utah. When people out west, when we think of forest, we think of pine trees. But he had these missionaries come. He gave them kind of a rousing sermon that, today you're planting trees, and this place is going to touch the hearts and lives of thousands of people for years to come. And it was funny, decades later, well, not funny, but decades later, having that same experience. And so my colleague Ben Pikel's, he shared this story about what Willard Bean did with these missionaries, and kind of echoed similar sentiments that they weren't planting seeds of faith or seeds of the gospel necessarily in people's hearts that day, but they were planting seeds that was going to create an environment that people could come to and learn of Joseph Smith, learn of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, and be a place where they can feel the Spirit and have the Spirit testify of the truthfulness of the events that occurred on that hill.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. There's not a way that I think, most of us would have known that had you not shared that, but that is unique. Willard Bean, if I'm not mistaken, is the one who is sort of air quotes depicted in the Fighting Preacher movie
Correct.
of a couple of years back by T.C. Christensen.
Correct. Yep.
Okay. So I wonder too this about maybe we spend another minute or two there at the Hill Cumorah. So with the pageant being a part of the history of the church, is there anything that is incorporated where we aren't doing the pageant anymore? Will people, are they able to know that was a thing? Was it ever videoed so that people could watch it if in the visitor center there, or is the attitude going to be sort of like, yeah, we did a pageant for a little while and now there's a forest trail and trees and go enjoy that?
So my understanding is that people can still see a video of the pageant on the church website. I haven't seen it myself on there because I saw it several times in person.
You're like, I'm good. I got this.
But one of the markers, so we put a few interpretive markers on the hill as well as people walked up to kind of help share the story. And one of the first markers does talk about the Hill Cumorah pageant and then the reforestation of the hill. And, the other thing to remember with this project is, where we're restoring a building, we can put the final nail in, we can open the door and, okay, we're done.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we've completed the project, but now we have to let Mother Nature and time take its course. And my children and my grandchildren will see the efforts of what we've been doing these last few years. They'll be the ones who'll be able to see the full restoration of the Hill Cumorah.
That's awesome. Let's take a quick break. When we come back in the second block, we'll move away from the Hill Cumorah and talk about some of the other historic sites. There are 22 others that we need to get into. We won't get into all of them, but we will spend some time on some other ones. Come back and do that in the second block of the Cultural Hall.
Okay.
Here in the second block of the Cultural Hall, you should become a Patreon saint of the Cultural Hall, if for no other reason, so you can see the video of this discussion with Gary Boatright. And even further, you would get to know why before we started recording today, we talked for at least 10 minutes about the books that he has on his bookshelf behind him. I'm not going to tell you what they are. You have to be a Patreon saint to see the video, but I can tell you they're awesome and worth talking about. Gary, so certainly there's a lot going on with the Joseph Smith home in Kirtland, the Hill Cumorah, and everything there. Are there other places where there is a lot going on that maybe we don't know about?
Well, is there a lot going on that you don't know about that I can tell you about?
Oh, yeah.
That's the
I mean, it's just me and you and thousands and thousands of other people. It's fine. You can. Yeah, I mean, I guess obviously that's the question. I'm sure that there's always something going on, but are there things that are maybe lesser known or have been kind of talked about, but maybe the media hasn't picked up, or things that you're excited for that you can tell me about?
Yeah, certainly. And I apologize. I live right north of the Hill Air Force Base runway. And the jets are taking off, so I don't know if you can hear that.
Well, I just hope that they're taking off as part of a routine thing. If it's something more serious, we have permission and we can shut this thing down.
So a couple projects that have been announced. One I mentioned earlier was in Canesville, Council Bluffs, Iowa. Mm-hmm. So a couple of decades ago, there was a group that had reconstructed the Canesville Tabernacle. And the Canesville Tabernacle was the site where Brigham Young, where the first presidency was reorganized. And Brigham Young was sustained as president of the church. And this wasn't a church project, but the site was eventually donated to and accepted by the church by President Gordon B. Hinckley. And so it became one of the official church historic sites. And sorry, I don't know if you can hear that.
Oh, you're fine.
So and so it was operated as a historic site for several years, but the structure over time was suffering. And we did our best to keep it up. But those who originally constructed the reconstruction constructed it in a similar manner that the original tabernacle was constructed in. And that was, they built it out of green cottonwood. And so this cottonwood just shrunk and shrunk over time, and it eventually led to an unsafe building. And so I can't remember if it was last year or in 2021, we actually raised the building. And well, I think it was last year, actually. Well, sorry, the last 3 years have just been jumbled together.
Why? What's been going on the last 3 years? What's been happening there? No, I completely understand.
And so what we're doing is we are keeping that location, and I should say that the reconstructed tabernacle wasn't built on the original location. It was several blocks from where it originally sat. But the story of the church in Council Bluffs, Iowa, and what was once called Canesville, after Thomas L. Kane, a good friend of the church, is a story that really isn't shared much.
Yeah, because as I'm sitting here, I'm trying to rack my brain. I mean, obviously, Council Bluffs is significant as far as the church goes, but when I think of the Canesville Tabernacle, there's nothing that comes to my mind where it's like, this was where this was received, or this is where this happened, or I'm racking my brain and I can't think of it, though I know that this is an historic site.
And that period, winter quarters, kind of takes all the limelight. And that's a bad way to say it, because it was terrible in winter quarters. What happened?
It's understood. Allowed. It's allowed, given the context.
But that's what people hear about. And winter quarters was only used, I believe, just for a couple of years, and then everybody moved to the Iowa side of the river, and Canesville, or Council Bluffs, really was the jumping off point for thousands of Latter-day Saints as they were heading west. It was a place where they were supplied, and made the preparations to go. It was the place where the Mormon battalion was mustered and began its march. And so this redesigned landscape will have some interpretive features that tell the aspects of the history of the church in Canesville, and Council Bluffs. I keep saying Canesville, but it's Council Bluffs today. And so we hope that will be something that will draw visitors more to that side of the river. Our visitation there has been quite a bit lower than at the Mormon Trail Center in Omaha, and it's just about a 20-minute drive. But we hope to elevate the history of the church in that period, and help people understand that it was a significant place and a significant period in church history.
So just making sure that I understand. So the tabernacle that was sort of built by a group that was donated to the church, that building has been raised, and we're not going to build another replica on the site. Is that correct?
That's correct. And part of the reason for the decision not to reconstruct it is because of accuracy. We like to reconstruct buildings on the places where they stood, and since that was not the original location, we opted not to do that. But that also gave us an opportunity to expand the interpretation beyond just this moment where the First Presidency was reorganized, but really this period of time where the church was in the area, and the great things that happened there.
Okay. What else? Are there other places that
so the Smith home in Kirtland, that is one that is, if you follow the Kirtland historic sites on Facebook, they've been posting updates and pictures of the reconstruction of that building, and that is coming along very nicely. We've had some few surprises with that.
Oh, yeah.
We mentioned some of that.
I've renovated a home. I know what a few surprises means.
But we're hoping that will be completed sometime this year.
Okay.
And that will be a extremely it's an important place in Kirtland. And Kirtland itself is important just as a whole with the temple and the whole story there. But the Joseph Smith home, well, the Joseph and Emma Smith home, several significant and key things took place there. And so we'll be able to share those things with visitors in the coming years.
Is that something that will be dedicated? Like, will there be a ceremony and a big thing, or do historic sites, because they're not a place of ordinances or doctrine, they just are like, and we're open?
So, well, we generally do a soft opening.
Okay.
So like with the Priesthood Restoration site and the Nauvoo Temple District, which was recently completed, we had a soft opening, but there was eventually a dedication. And in both of those cases, it was a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles who dedicated it. We anticipate that there will be a similar event with the home, but that hasn't been decided yet.
I'll give you my address so I can be part of the invitation. I would like to attend that. Having the opportunity to serve in and around that area, I think that would be just a phenomenal experience.
As would I. I don't even know if I'll get an invitation.
Any other places of particular note that the church is putting focus that you can tell us about? I'm sure that there's plenty in the works, and I don't want to get you in trouble, but if there's something that you can tease us with, maybe.
So the other thing that has been announced, but it was a kind of not a quiet announcement, but it didn't get picked up by much, is the Beehive House.
Oh, in Salt Lake.
In Salt Lake. And
okay.
We recently restored 2 rooms there that were tied to Joseph F. Smith and the revelation that he received. But the church recently approved a larger project that will increase the long-term preservation of the building. The building, it's an adobe building, and adobe, isn't the most strongest of materials.
Mm-hmm.
And so there'll be a project to help with that. Right now, it was announced that the Beehive House will close on April 8th. And I'm not part of that project, so I don't know the details, but the rest of Temple Square has been ripped up and worked on, and I guess I figured, well, we might as well do something with the Beehive House while we're doing
well,
it.
and they added the Joseph Smith Memorial Building as well to be part of that.
That's correct, yeah.
And that seems like that hasn't been too long ago that was sort of renovated itself. What do you know anything about that project that you're allowed to?
I don't know anything about that. So,
yeah, because when they announced that, like the Beehive House, I definitely was like, okay, I get it. There's some stuff there, and is I guess a question that I have is, because I don't think we mentioned it when we talked about the 23 sites. So is all of Temple Square like another? Is that someone else's dominion? They are in charge of all that. That's not you.
It is someone else's dominion. Well, it's kind of everybody's dominion.
Sure.
Almost all church departments have a hand in Temple Square. And obviously, as the church historical department, we have a hand there as well. But, the missionary department is in charge of the interpretation with the missionaries there. There's a department called Headquarters Facilities, which is involved in there. The Special Projects Department. I mean, Temple Square, it really is the epicenter for the church. It is the place where people come. So everybody, it's a very collaborative relationship as how Temple Square is managed. And even with all these projects that are going on, it's very, very collaborative, and that would be exciting to see when things are done and open and people can go back and visit all those places.
A question that sort of dawns on me as we've been talking, I'll throw it out there. How do you deal with members' fervor around historic sites?
Wow. That's a great question, and lots of things are going through my mind because the fervor can be on such a wide plane of what people are excited about or passionate about. Help me understand more kind of what's in what
Well,
you're thinking.
I mean, I guess a few things, right? One, take for example the Canesville. I'm imagining that people that built that tabernacle were members of the church and were like, "Here's our dedication and here's our devotion," and then they give it to you, and the church is like, "Raise it. We're gonna make it, and we're gonna do that." So I'm betting that there's some interesting sort of politics that reside around that. And then I can also remember, touring the Kirtland Temple and the attitude of members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints towards the members of the Community of Christ that are like, one day we'll own this, this sort of entitlement. I just feel like there's a lot of attitudes around historic sites that don't often get the opportunity to be discussed. And I wonder how you, the operations manager for Historic Sites Division, deals with all of those different elements of this.
So I'm going to separate those two things out. I'm going to address the first part, and then I'm going to get on my soapbox for the second part.
Okay, please.
So you're correct. I mean, there were people involved, and I'll use the Canesville Tabernacle as an example as you brought it up, but it is representative of other projects that we've had, and where you have had, or we have had somebody or a group very invested in a historic site. And in this case, with the Canesville Tabernacle, they built it. They financed it, they built it, they actually operated it for a period of time before it was donated to the church. And I should say there were about 2 decades, if I remember correctly, between the time we received it and the time we raised it. So it wasn't like they gave it to us and, we knocked it down the next day. Just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
But it is sensitive. I mean, people have put their heart and soul into sharing the history of the church in a way that they felt was appropriate. And not saying that it wasn't appropriate, but that's how they conveyed it, was through this reconstruction. And so as we were going through, kind of discussing what we needed to do, it wasn't, a group of us in the room and saying, okay, we're going to tear it down. We took very deliberate steps to reach out to everybody who was involved. Some of them had passed on. Mm-hmm. We reached out to family members and others, and shared with them why we were doing what we were doing, shared with them, our concerns about the safety of the structure. We also worked very closely with the city and local church leaders as well, because, they're passionate about it as well. And the one thing with any historic site, the work we do is naturally collaborative. There are so many stakeholders with a historic site. There's not just the church and the missionaries, there's the community, there's priesthood leaders, there's all sorts of connections to a historic site. In some cases we have school groups that come to our sites, and we share with them the history of their area. Like at the Mormon Trail Center in Omaha, we have school groups come, because that history that we are telling is also part of their community history. It's not just church history. And so we're very mindful of those who have a love and an interest, and in some cases have invested their time and their means to preserve or to share some aspect of church history. And we've had several projects during the course of my career where we have had to reach out to folks and let them know what we were doing, why we were doing it, even get some counsel from them. And, we don't go to them with a hard and fast decision, but we really do want their counsel and feedback. And we want, people to feel good about things. Now, shifting gears to kind of the second part of your question.
And I'm actually going to interrupt you real quick and say, we don't call it a soapbox here in the cultural hall. We call it a rammy-umptum. So climb up on the rammy-umptum and say whatever you would like to say.
I am climbing up on it to the tallest point. So let me start out by this. The community of Christ, formerly known as the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we love them. They are our friends. They are spiritually our brothers and sisters. Religiously, they're our spiritual cousins. We have a shared heritage. And, we could get all into, all the reasons why they have the temple or why they have sites in Nauvoo and we don't. I don't really care about past history. Our friends and they literally are our friends. We know them, we love them, we work together with them, we reach out to them. There's one of their members who is on their Historic Sites Foundation board. When I'm in Disneyland, she comes with us. I mean, she's a friend of our family. And they have done a wonderful job preserving this shared heritage. And it's heartbreaking for me when members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints say things like, well, one day we'll have this. Or, I went to the Kirtland temple and I didn't feel the spirit at all. They just ruined it. Or they just talked about history and didn't talk about the spiritual events. None of that is true. So the community of Christ, they know their audience. They know that a significant portion of visitors who come to their sites are Latter-day Saints. And they share those stories, which we as Latter-day Saints hold dear. And, the community of Christ may see things a little differently, but they still share those stories because it's what happened there. Mm-hmm. And, for people to say, well, I've never felt the spirit at a community of Christ site. Well, that's not the community of Christ's fault. That's the individual's fault. Because some of the most powerful experiences I have had are at their sites. And their tour guides are well trained. They're very knowledgeable. They know how to lead tours. Locke Mackay, who is the head of their Historic Sites program and apostle in the Community of Christ, I could go on a tour with Locke every day of the week and never get tired of it. He is amazing. And, I've been able to take my family to Nauvoo and we were privileged to have Locke go through the home with us. And, my family loved it. Mm-hmm. And it hurts when I hear these comments from Latter-day Saints. We're not better than our friends in the community of Christ. We're not doing a better job than they are. And people talk about, well, their finances, this and that. Well, I don't care about that. That's their institution. They don't worry about us. I mean, but I wish members of our faith, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, would show the community of Christ and their tour guides the same respect that they have for our sites. Because the members of the community of Christ, they love these sites, the Kirtland Temple, the Nauvoo sites, just as much as we do. And they love the sites that we own and operate just as much as we do. And they visit our sites as well, and we welcome them. So I really wish members would just follow the counsel of the Savior. Love your neighbor. We may have differences of opinion when it comes to doctrine and maybe even different interpretations of history. But visiting the Kirtland Temple or visiting the Mansion House or the Red Brick Store with an attitude that, yeah, one day we're going to own this, or the Spirit's not here. Well, yeah, you're not going to feel the Spirit with an attitude like that. Be grateful, be appreciative, say thank you, after your tour, and I've even heard some members complain, well, God, you got to pay $7 to go to the Kirtland Temple. It's like, well, have you ever been to Colonial Williamsburg or any other museum or historic site?
Jeez.
That $7 is the best $7 you'll ever spend. So, but also, I would encourage our members to go to those sites. I've heard several people over the years, purposefully not go to their sites because of this misconception. And if you go to Kirtland without going to the Kirtland Temple, you have not gone to Kirtland.
Right. You completely missed the point.
Completely missed the point. And same with Nauvoo. If you go to Nauvoo and not go to the red brick store and the homestead and the mansion house, you have not gone to Nauvoo. I mean, I'm a huge Disneyland fan. I love Disneyland, and I always go on Pirates of the Caribbean because that is what you do when you go to Disneyland. And the same is said for these other places. I mean, do our members go to Palmyra and not go to the Sacred Grove? I mean, that's what it would be. That's what it's akin to. So I really hope that and I have seen an improvement over the years. It certainly isn't as bad as it was, but we still need to improve, and not just in our relationships with the community of Christ, but in all aspects of our life, to really live the counsel of the Savior, to love our neighbor. But there are no exceptions to that. No footnotes saying yes, but not these people or these people or these people. So sorry, I started getting
I love it.
Ramyampton there. So
I love that idea that in the scriptures it's like, as I've loved you, love one another, except, and then you go down to the footnote and it's like, it's this and this and the other thing. And there, let's take another break. A couple more questions for you, and then questions that we ask everyone who steps into the Cultural Hall. I'll do that as we come back in the third block. Here in the third block of the Cultural Hall, remember, you can always email us, contact@theculturalhall.com. That's the way you can suggest guests if you think you might be a good guest. If you have someone in your ward, you've been reading a book by someone, maybe if you don't even have connection to that person, but you're like, man, this person needs some time in the Cultural Hall, you can send us those, contact@theculturalhall.com. We'd love to visit with those folks. I thought about just ending the episode, Gary, after what you just said, because I feel like that's a great drop mic moment, and we just go, yeah, that's it. But because I have a few more minutes with you, I'm curious, how do sites become historic sites?
Well, there's a long bureaucratic process to that. We do have some guidelines, and there's a lot of factors that go into that. Resources is one of them. Even if, hypothetically, if somebody were to donate a historic site to us, which we get several times a year, there's those long-term resources to care for, maintain, staff, and so that plays into it. Also the resources of our staff, as I mentioned, we really are a smaller staff when you can compare it to the program of the historic sites program of the church, and so that has to be taken into account as well. But we have really focused on what we call the key sites of the restoration. And so if you look at some of the development projects that we have done, and with the Priesthood restoration site, is probably the most significant. For many years after the church purchased that, Wilford Wood purchased it on behalf of the church, and there's a long, wonderful story there. But it pretty much sat for years. The church did a little bit of development there. We placed a monument commemorating the restoration of the Aaronic priesthood. But when you look at its significance to the worldwide church, it was surprising that we hadn't done more there. Because the restoration of the priesthood, if you're a Latter-day Saint wherever you are around the world, that is significant to you, and that impacts your life directly. And so as we look at opportunities to expand the historic sites program, I think the focus really is now on those key sites. What are those sites that really impact members of the church around the world? And so, like the Sacred Grove, well, anything from New York to Nauvoo really is those things. The Western sites really more of our U.S. story. We find that international members of the church really don't, I shouldn't say don't care, but
yeah, it's of different significance. It makes sense.
Different significance. And then also, there's this whole question about international historic sites.
Sure.
And that's a door that we've opened and peeked our head in a little bit. We have, I would say, an aggressive historic markers program. We have placed historic markers around the world in the last decade. But purchasing a site, developing it, staffing it, aside from the Smith home in Kirtland, we really haven't acquired much that would technically be a new historic site. In fact, I think the Smith home is really the only one. We purchased that, and I think around 2010, maybe 2012. Sorry, I'm a historian, but I'm terrible with dates. That's why I have books, so I don't need a number. But we do get requests all the time. Some are significant sites, some are not so significant. I could share with you several stories of sites we have turned down, but we could do that offline. Some of them are. So yeah, I feel like I'm starting to.
As you sort of go through that, I'm sort of racking my brain to think, what are some of those significant moments that maybe don't have an historic site dedicated to them presently that isn't owned by either us or by the community of Christ. And so I'm sort of thinking through some of these things, and I'm like, well, no, there's a presence there already. And so I'm trying to get you to trap and fall into something, but it's not going to happen.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, those key places, those we have a presence, obviously, with the Kirtland Temple, but we have access to it.
Sure.
It's open. It's, visitors are welcome.
And that's a valid point. I think the church would feel very differently if the community of Christ had a different attitude towards members of the church.
That might be a fair statement. It's hard to play what ifs.
Sure. Yeah. And that might get you in a lot more trouble than it would me. So maybe we shut that down pretty quick. Other things that sort of came to my mind as you were chatting about that, the Wood family that purchased that,
yes.
That is a story in and of itself. So I just want to tease everyone that is on the docket to have an episode of the Cultural Hall about the Wood family. So if you don't know, lock that back in the back of your brain, because that is a story that you won't even believe at all, from back in those times to present day. Everything around that is one of the most fascinating stories within church history and within the church that I've ever been privy to, which I just think is fascinating. The other thing that I guess I would wonder is, do you have a favorite?
Oh, so I visit almost every historic site every year.
Mm-hmm.
And the missionaries, every time I visit, they ask me that question. And so I'm going to give you two answers. Hopefully none of them are listening to this, because
Hopefully all of them are listening to this. What kind of?
well,
I get what you mean.
but when they ask me that question, I tell them that my favorite historic site is the one that I'm presently visiting.
Mm-hmm.
Because in reality, they're kind of like my kids.
Sure.
You can't choose a favorite. And I love each site for different reasons. Now I have had more involvement with a few of the sites. Prior to this role that I'm in now as the operations manager, I was a historic sites curator and a historic landscape expert. And so I spent a lot of time with the Sacred Grove, with the management of the Sacred Grove, documenting the care and the management of that. And I've walked every foot of the trails in there multiple times, and you have to love the Sacred Grove.
Sure.
But I can see a picture, and generally I know where that picture was taken in the Sacred Grove. I've been so involved in that. So the Sacred Grove is a special place to me. I won't dare say it's my favorite, but it's a favorite place of mine, or a sacred place of mine. One of my favorites, I should say. The other is the Joseph Smith birthplace. And
Interesting.
The reason a couple reasons for that. That was my very first assignment when I came into the historic sites program, was to write the interpretive material for that site for the missionaries to use. So it was the first historic site I visited in an official capacity. And from that site also kind of grew this landscape expertise that I gained, because there were specific needs we needed there. We developed what's called a cultural landscape report. If you ever have trouble sleeping, search for a cultural landscape report. It will put you right to sleep. But as I studied the landscape of the Joseph Smith birthplace, and the history of that site in and of itself is just amazing. You have Junius Wells, who developed the site, and he created all these features, these landscape features, many of which were lost over time. And as we studied it and learned about all these things, we got to kind of peek into his mind of what he was trying to do. And really, that it wasn't just the monument that he created to commemorate Joseph Smith, but everything on the landscape was designed to commemorate the prophet and his mission. So there's a special place in my heart for the Joseph Smith birthplace. It's one of the most underappreciated sites, I think. It's also one of the hardest to get to.
Yes. I went there last year, and it is one of the hardest to get to, for sure.
Yeah. And I mean, there's a saying in Vermont that, you can't get there from here. and that is so true. I mean, you have to go somewhere else to actually get to the Joseph Smith birthplace. And that's, but it's beautiful. Well, you've been there.
Sure. Tucked away, nice and quiet.
Yeah, just beautiful, pristine.
Yeah, you don't envision that you're going to kind of come up over this thing and be like, oh, okay, a monolith, and all of this history there.
Yeah,
pretty amazing.
And one thing I will say, I'm kind of diverging into another thing, is when people visit historic sites, they visit them, but rarely do they give enough time to experience them. And with the Joseph Smith birthplace as an example, I've walked every square foot of the property we have there for various reasons. And I'm not saying people have to do that,
Mm-hmm.
but if you just go there, you're on a tight time schedule. A lot of people, we see this when we're there, is they'll drive up the loop, they'll stop, not even get out of their car, take a picture of the monument with their window rolled down, then go and be on their way. And I think, you have invested so much time and money to get here, and you're just taking a picture. There are other things to see there, but even in the Sacred Grove, people, well, all the sites, I don't have to pinpoint any site, people are in such a hurry that, they can check it off their list that they've been to the Sacred Grove or they've been to the No Cave Whitney store, but have they experienced it? Give yourself time to walk through the Grove, to think about what happened there, to just enjoy the sights, the sounds, the feeling, the spirit that's there. Same with Nauvoo. I mean, one of my favorite things to do in Nauvoo is to either wake up in the early morning or in the evening, just as the sun's setting, and walk around the streets. Not talk to anybody, just walk around the streets and imagine what was this place like in the 1840s. And, I could go on and give an example at every historic site, but if you're going to invest the time and the resources and the effort to go to one of these sacred places, experience it. Don't just visit it, experience it. And I wish that would be the other thing I would get on the Ramyampton for and yell, is to have people really plan out their trips so they can experience these sites.
Yeah. Gary, there are 3 questions we ask everyone who steps into the Cultural Hall. I'll ask those of you right now. The first question is do you have a calling? And if so, what is it?
I do have a calling. My wife and I serve as the group leaders at a care center here in our ward. So we coordinate the Sunday services and really kind of are the shepherds of some more senior folks who live in this care center. And I have threatened my bishop that if he releases us, we will walk away from the church. Now, that's not true, but it is a wonderful calling that has been a blessing to not only my life, but my wife and my family as well.
Well, it's such a tremendous blessing when you're able to visit with these people who have lived entire lives and have just such a wealth of knowledge. I've had the opportunity in a couple of wards that I've just lived in, not to serve in my calling as far as that goes, but to go and assist, and you just sit down and go,
yeah, do
you have any idea? And it's like, whoa, I had no idea about that. And every single one of those people has that story to tell individually. Yeah. If you could pick a calling for yourself, either one that exists or make one up, what would you pick?
Oh, so my wife thinks I'm crazy for this. I love speaking in sacrament meeting. I don't know why. If I could just be kind of a rotating sacrament meeting speaker.
Isn't that a high counselor?
Well, no, I don't want the other responsibility. But especially church history talk. Obviously, I'm passionate about church history, and now I think I'm a decent speaker. I don't know if the audience would agree with that, but if I had my choice, yeah, I'd speak in sacrament a little more frequently. So,
what do you mean? Like every 6 months, every month, every couple months? Give me an idea.
So at one point, I used to be an executive secretary for a stake. And I was kind of the backup speaker for the high councilman when they needed someone. And there was a couple of days where I actually spoke in 3 wards on the same day. I love that.
Okay.
That might be a little too much, but again, my wife thinks I'm crazy that I like speaking. But...
Tell you what, Gary, next time I'm asked to speak, I'm going to say, I appreciate the invitation. I've got a guy. He'll come down. and he'll take whatever the assignment is. That sounds great. And then they'll give you, if enough people listening to this give you that opportunity, I think it'll fulfill what your wish is. The last
Sounds
question
good.
we ask everyone, we ask you to interpret it however you may, but the question remains, what is your favorite part of your faith?
Oh. So I know you asked this of people, and I've been thinking about it. I think the favorite part of my faith, and this is something that really has, I think I've grown into, especially in the last few years, is really just how inclusive my faith, meaning not my individual faith, but my faith as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that we really are inclusive. There is a place for all. When I read the words of our modern day prophets and the words of the Savior, and I mentioned this a couple of times in our discussion today, the Lord just wants us to love everybody. And that is what I love about the gospel of Jesus Christ. I can disagree with somebody's political opinions. I may even disagree with their lifestyle, but I can still love them. I can still be friends with them.
Mm-hmm.
I can still put my arms around them and tell them I love them. We, as Latter-day Saints, we believe in free agency. But lately it seems like we only believe in it if you agree with us.
Right.
But I love the fact that Christ welcomes all. And I believe the church welcomes all. I think what keeps us from that is us as members and our prejudices, our biases, but that's the other thing I love about our faith and my faith is I can overcome those things, and it's pretty simple. Just love everyone.
Simple and also hard, right?
Yes.
It's the simplest, hardest thing that we could ever be asked to do, but I mean, it is very simple.
Yeah.
Hard to execute on. Gary, I've appreciated our conversation. I hope that this episode has nourished and strengthened your body, that if you're not healthy enough to listen this week, that you'll be healthy enough to listen next week, and that when the time comes, you'll be able to travel home in safety. In the meantime, we'll be saving a seat for you on the back row of the Cultural Hall.